Lesson 6, adding totals. Well, okay, there's two major obstacles to having the macro recorder work. We already talked about the first one, relative references. We talked about that in lesson 4. This other one, though, frustrated me for the first 10 years that I was using Excel's macro recorder. The simple fact that the auto sum button cannot be recorded correctly by the macro recorder. This is so frustrating. It's like the guy at Microsoft who programmed the auto sum button and the guy at Microsoft who does the macro recorder. Have they never met at the coffee maker? How can it be that the macro recorder cannot record the concept of using the auto sum button? And like I said, for 10 years, this drove me crazy. I always would have to switch over to VBA and fix this line of code. I finally have a workaround after 10 years of using the macro recorder. So I'm going to pass this along to you in this lesson. Let's get started. All right, so let me set up the situation here. Let's say that we get this file from our IT department every day. It's called, invoice.csv, and we've imported it using a macro. And now we need to go through and do some formatting to this. I think I want to add totals at the last row, and the totals want to be for columns E, F, and G. After I'm done adding the totals, I'm actually going to turn relative references off and go back up to cell A1, so that way I can do some things to the headings. I want to make those headings bold. Once the headings are bold, I'm going to use the autofit for columns to make the columns wide enough. So that's my whole plan. I kind of have it worked out here in my head exactly how this is all going to fly. Of course, because it's a CSV file, we can trust that we start in cell A1 every time. So I'm going to record the first macro, go to Developer. I'll see that relative reference is turned on, which is good because to get down to that final row, the total row, we need to have relative reference on. So I click Record Macro, and I'll call this Add Totals Take 1. Shortcut key Control-Shift-T, store it in this workbook, that's fine. We'll click OK. All right, so relative is on. I can use the End key like we talked about in Lesson 5. Press the End key and the down arrow. That'll get me to the last row. And then one more. We'll type the word total and head over to column E. Now, a cool trick here, this is cool in the regular Excel, is to select all 3 cells before we hit the auto sum button. That'll actually put the totals in a little bit faster. So we go to the Home tab. I use the auto sum button and bam, the totals are in. Life is great. Okay, now, this is the point where I'm actually going to turn off relative recording. Because if you think about it, right now, if I click on cell A1, it's going to say, in a relative fashion, we want to go up 13 rows. Well, tomorrow I might have 20 rows of invoices, and it's not that I want to go up 13. It's that I always want to go back to row 1. There's actually 2 ways to do this. You could use the go-to command to go to row 1, and that will be recorded like an absolute action. But for me, it's just easier to turn off, use relative reference, and then I can come up here and choose A1 to G1. All right, now that I have these selected, I want to make them bold, so I go back and I use the bold icon. And finally, I want to select all cells and use Format Column Autofit Selection. So I'll select all cells. And I can either use the shortcut being double-click right here between G and H, or I could go in and use Format Autofit Column Width. Either one would have been exactly the same to the macro recorder. All right, so I look at this. My headings are bold. My total's in the right place. I think that I used the correct combination of relative and non-relative. I'm going to stop recording. And frankly, I can't wait until I get Tuesday's file so I can test this out and see how it works. Well, kind of like the cooking shows, when they put one thing in one oven and immediately they have something to get out of the second oven. I already have Tuesday's file here. So we can test this macro out. I'm going to press Control-Shift-T. What I want to see is that the totals are in row 18 and not in row 14. I'll feel good about that. My headings are bold. Everything is the right width. The totals are in the right place. If I wasn't careful, I would feel really good about this result and print it, mail it out to the world. Unfortunately, there's a huge problem. Can you take a look at the screen and tell me what the problem is? There's a couple of clues. All right, do you see it? If you're really good at math, you can size up these numbers right here and see that they really should add up to more than 6.8 million. But I mean, frankly, who's that good at math? But here's the one that you can do. 45 plus 15 plus 12 certainly is not 45. And even better, a cool tip, these little green triangles, frankly, these green triangles drive most of us crazy because most of the time they're warning us about something silly like, oh, this is a number but it's stored as text. Well, okay, yeah, I wanted it stored as text. It's an account number. But in this particular case, that green triangle is actually telling me something very, very useful. It's saying this formula omits adjacent cells. Let's take a look at the formula and see what happened. When we press F2 to edit the formula, basically it's grabbing the 12 rows immediately above the cell. What's up with that? The AutoSum button should go all the way up to the top until it hits a blank cell or a non-numeric cell. But for some reason, this macro, when we played it back, only grabbed the last 12 cells. Why is it doing that? Well, because when we recorded the macro and I was here and I hit the AutoSum button, it grabbed the last 12 cells. And unfortunately, that's what the macro recorder recorded. Hey, we want to grab the last 12 cells. Isn't that insane? I mean, it's one of the most common functions, the AutoSum button, but yet the macro recorder cannot correctly record this. And if you're not careful, you're going to record a macro that is not going to work. As I said, this frustrated me for 10 years. I couldn't figure out a solution to this, and I would always have to go in and look at the code and rewrite that formula so that way the formula would work. But it turns out that there is a way to convince the macro recorder to do the right thing. Let's just take a look at this formula right here. Is there a way that you could write a sum formula that would say go from row 17, the row right above me, but always, always, always go back to row 2? Now, this is kind of a trick question because frankly, no one would ever type this formula because it would be silly to type this formula. But what I want to do is I want to go from F17 colon and not to F2 but to F $2. The $2. You know, the dollar sign says that that's an absolute reference. So it's saying, hey, we're always going back to row 2 every single time. Now, of course, we would never really do this in real life unless we're recording a macro. It turns out that when you type the formula in that fashion, that is the code to convince the macro recorder to understand what we're trying to do. The macro recorder will understand that we want to go from row 2 every single time to the row right above us. So let's try it again. I'll demonstrate this. I'm going to go on to Wednesday's file and we'll record the same macro. I'll go back to Developer, Record New Macro. I'll call it Add Totals, Take 2, shortcut key. Well, I already used T, so I'm just going to use Control-Shift-R because it's next to the T. Click OK. I want to be careful. I want to make sure relative references are on. Press End, down arrow one more time. Type the word total. I come over here to column E and I want to enter a formula equals sum of $2 colon E8. I'll press Control Enter to accept that formula and now grab the fill handle to drag it across. Alright, so I've finished my formulas. Remember now, before we go back up to row 1, I want to turn off relative reference, choose those cells, Control B for bold, select all of the cells, and double click between G and H to make all of the columns wide enough. And finally, stop recording. Okay, so now let's see how this works. We'll go to Thursday, where we now have more records again. So as I run this macro, Control-Shift-R, I want to see that the totals end up in row 19, and I want to see that the service revenue comes up to 65,000 instead of 55,000. So here's the test. Control-Shift-R. Take a look at the result. Okay, totals are where I expected them to be. That's great. The total formula here actually works. It goes from F2 to F18. It gets all of the numbers. So, very subtle difference between using AutoSum and typing this formula. If you're using the macro recorder and you want your macros to work, we have to pay attention to relative reference. We also have to remember to never, ever, ever touch the AutoSum button. The macro recorder just is not going to record it correctly, and you're going to end up eventually with the wrong result when you play that macro back on a different size data set. Well, there you have it. The other major annoyance when we're using the macro recorder, the AutoSum doesn't work. You learned today a way to write that formula without using AutoSum, so that way we can record it. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at the Trust Center settings. What happens when we try and open a macro later and play it back, and some options that we have there. I hope you found this lesson useful.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live Lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.